Okay. Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding. Now, let me figure out how to. So, David Hume, 1711 to 1776. So, again, roughly the same era as the folks we've been looking at so far, but now slightly more modern. His father died when he was very young, 2 years old, and he grew up poor. However, showed himself to be extremely intelligent from a very young age and started attending the University of Edinburgh at 10 years old. He was a lively person. He, of all the philosophers you will study, a lot of them are peculiar. Some of them are jerks. Hume is the one that if they ask you, who in the history of philosophy would you like to have a beer with? The answer is David Hume. In part because he was just an incredibly fun social person. He is the sort of person who would have a beer with you. He was renowned for being a very good poker player, billiards player. He was just a fun, nice human being. Now, he was also a troublemaker philosophically. He is, you could think of him as sort of the bad boy of the early modern period, right? He's that troublemaker who just loves knocking things down. So what we'll see in some sense is a structure, a system building things up, but primarily he's a wrecking ball. He's going to go at every major school and try to undermine its most fundamental beliefs. And he did this in his first book, Treatise on Human Nature. And he was convinced that when this book came out, it was going to cause an uproar in the entire philosophical community. Every corner of every debate was going to turn on him, and he'd parry them off with these brilliant counter arguments. He'd become the most famous philosopher in the world by taking on the entire world. And no one read the book. And his famous phrase, the book fell stillborn from the presses. So he doesn't become famous. He doesn't become a professor. He just gets ignored. He ends up working as a librarian at the University of Edinburgh, but is unable to get a faculty position to him because of his atheism. And so while that book doesn't sell, he doesn't get his job teaching, he's in the library. And when you're in the library, you're surrounded by books. And when you're surrounded by books, you read. And so Hume writes a new book. In fact, he writes a very big encyclopedic, multi-volume history of England from a Scottish Tory perspective. And this book actually becomes extremely popular. It sells huge amounts, and that makes David Hume actually a very wealthy man as a historian, not as a philosopher. Well, he still can't get a job teaching, and so he takes a job as the secretary to the British ambassador to France. Now, this was a very important person with whom he becomes very tight. This was the British general who led the invasion of Canada. You might be thinking to yourself, what British invasion of Canada? Well, it never happened, but it was being planned, and that's how important this guy was, that he was going to lead it. And by being his sort of personal attaché, Hume now is introduced to all sorts of British high society figures and now is sort of launched into the circles of power. He goes with him over to Paris, and what he finds there is Scotland, Wales, no one was reading David Hume's philosophy. In France, they were. Unbeknownst to him, he was a famous philosopher in a different country. So he falls in with the circle of philosophes in Paris. He is celebrated, and he becomes very good friends with the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In fact, when Hume leaves and returns, now Rousseau suffered from paranoia and was convinced that everyone in Scotland was out to get him. He and Hume had a big blow up, and Rousseau went back to France. They continued to correspond for a while, but after a bit, even that sort of petered out. Now, he wrote several books in addition. All right, we're going to read his most famous philosophical work, or pieces of it. But there was one important book that he wrote that even he didn't have the guts to publish, and that was his book, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. This was a book that he found to be just too hot even for him. And so he maintained the manuscript. And when he passed away, in his will, the manuscript was given to his friend Adam Smith, the father of modern capitalism. And Smith was supposed to get it published. Well, Smith read it, and Smith thought, oh, this is way too hot for me to even touch. And so Smith didn't bother at all trying to find a publisher. According to his will, after 5 years, the manuscript went from Smith to Hume's nephew, also named David, and the nephew did eventually publish it, but it was so provocative that the publisher agreed to publish it only if the publisher's name appeared nowhere on the volume. That's provocative philosophy. Welcome to David Hume. So he starts the inquiry with section 1 of the different species of philosophy. Right? And he's going to say that there is this distinction between two very different kinds of philosophy. On the one hand, there's the easy and obvious philosophy that appeals to beauty and the passions. This is the stuff that tends to be very popular because it touches us where we want. It's easy to read. It's just... But then there's the other kind of philosophy, the difficult, abstruse philosophy that actually requires work, that appeals to reason. And what he says is that first kind of philosophy, that'll sell books. That'll make you rich and famous. That ain't the kind he's interested in. It's the second kind that will get you ignored and forgotten. But that's the sort of philosophy he says we need to do. He writes, it's certain the easy and obvious philosophy will always, with the generality of mankind, have the preference above the accurate and abstruse, and by many will be recommended not only as the more agreeable, but the more useful than the other. So most people are morons. They like easy things that already agree with what they think about, which spoon feeds them, as opposed to real philosophy, which is challenging, which is hard, which makes you uncomfortable. This first section includes one of the most famous quotations from Hume. Be a philosopher, but amid all your philosophy, be still a man. In other words, what he's arguing is that what we're about to read in this philosophical text is going to challenge the very foundations of everything, right? He is a skeptic of the first order. And if you're a skeptic, you're tempted to not believe anything, but you still have to live life, right? You have to, at some point, leave your overstuffed chair in your study and emerge into the world. And there's nothing wrong with doing hard philosophy while you're in the study. In fact, you should. But remember that it's a part of a lived life. And so his argument is this. Look, Human beings have two interesting but seeming conflicting properties. We're both rational and we're social. When the balance is out of whack, we get poor philosophy and poorly lived lives. But remember, the truth is not always pleasant, right? So we can't ignore good philosophy just for a happier life. We need to live a happy life, but we also need to do serious philosophy. So when we actually look for truth, buckle up, right? He puts it this way. Obscurity indeed is painful to the mind as well as the eye, but to bring light from obscurity by whatever labor must necessarily begin from this hard philosophy, from this difficult, challenging set of thoughts, actually bring light, bring enlightenment, bring realization, lead us to truth. But it's going to require labor. It's going to be hard work. But that hard work will be delightful and rejoicing. So let's rejoice. Section 2 of the origins of ideas. So he begins this section, right, in a way that shouldn't seem that outrageous, right? If you read section 2, you think, okay, this is just straight ahead empiricism, right? This would come right out of Locke, right? He draws the distinction between ideas. So an impression is something that comes from direct sense perception of an object, right? Look at something. You look at your computer. You see it, right? That is that the object creates a sense impression in your mind. And that sense impression is very sharp. Now, close your eyes and think of the computer. You can still sort of see it in your mind, right? But what's in your mind, your memory of it is not as sharp, it's not as detailed, right? That, it's like a painting with dulled colors, right? So we have ideas, but we need to distinguish where Locke didn't, right? We need to be a little careful about this, right? Locke, Berkeley, all of the other empiricists wanted to say that whatever is in the mind is an idea, whether that idea comes from direct perception or whether that idea comes right from imagination. He wants to say, no. There is a difference. There's a difference between what the world gives your senses and what your mind can produce or maintain of its own, right? Impressions are going to be sharp and come from the external world, and we do need to distinguish between those and ideas, which are what gets stored within the mind. Now, these ideas can only come from the impressions, right? This is where he and Locke are going to agree with each other, right? We can't just come up whole cloth with new ideas that we had never had any way of observing, but they are different once we sort of save them in the mind. And he has two arguments for this. The first, he says, is, look, break down any complex idea. Right? He says you could do this even with the idea of God. Right? Clearly, that's a dig at Descartes, who wants to say, I have this clear and distinct idea. It's not distinct at all. Right? It's complex. I can break it down into pieces. And all of the pieces, all of the parts that you attribute to God, I get those from the senses. Right? What do you see when you break it down? Take, the building and break it down into the little building blocks. You got nothing but blocks. And we know where each block comes from. It comes from the senses. He then says, look, here's our second argument. You can't acquire a simple idea just through the use of language or reason, right? The idea, he goes back to an example that we did see in Locke. Can you convince a blind person what color is? Can a blind person come to understand color in the way that you understand it? You can be as eloquent and poetic with your language as you can be. You can be as analytic as you want in your reasoning. It ain't going to happen. It's only mind. So this is just Locke. A little tweak here and there, but really it's just garden variety empiricism, right? I mean, it's nothing we haven't seen. This is Hume. And he says, well, here's an argument that proves that the mind can give rise to an. That person has seen the color blue many times. The sky is blue. The sea is blue. Blue jeans are blue, right? Has seen lots and lots of blue all throughout her life. Now, one day, every single shade of blue that she's seen gets laid out in front of her. And the interesting thing is, while she has seen lots and lots and lots of different blues, by shade of blue that this person has never just happened to observe. There's one shade, one particular shade, sort of between aqua and turquoise, that the person just has, happened to have never come across. Now, if you were to lay out in a row all of the shades of blue that this person had seen, the person could go, hey, wait a minute, there's one missing right there. There's a jump between these two, and the person would be able to picture to themselves, Hume thinks, exactly what that shade of blue is. And so, in this case, Hume argues, the mind, reason itself, could come up with a basic idea. Now, notice that this doesn't bring down empiricism. It certainly doesn't hand the game over to the rationalists. He's not going to say the ideas of blue are innate, which is why, right? And he's not going to say that, if you hadn't seen blue at all, you wouldn't be able to come up with the idea of blue. So it's still an empiricist argument, but it is an empiricist argument that strikes at one of the foundational arguments for empiricism. Hume is sawing off the branch he's sitting on.
Did he left?
Yeah, we lost him.
I was wondering why it went really quiet. I thought he was pausing for effect.
I think if he joins back, it'll make him the host again. But
Okay.
we'll have to see.
Do you think? Hey, it's still recording.
Yep.
Yes, it is.
So how are you guys?
Haven't had my morning coffee yet. A little tired. How are you?
I'm vibing. Oh, he's
There we
back.
go.
Hello.
Steve. Hello.
Oh, I
Wait,
think someone went on the
I can't
ban
hear
with him.
him.
I think he's in another room, and I think he's yelling at somebody for going on the internet while he's teaching.
Sorry about that. We lost. No. Okay. I apologize for that break.
No worries.
Section 3 of the Association of Ideas. Now, this is actually going to be a really... I'm sorry? Are we... Okay, everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So, moving forward, especially when we get to Kant, this is going to be a really important move he makes. So, of the Association of Ideas. So, when you look at Locke, when you look at Berkeley, when you look at all of the other empiricists, one of the things they do is they get us from sense perception to ideas. But the point is we don't think in ideas, right? So for Locke, it really is about simple ideas combining to complex ideas. But the world is really more than ideas. When we look at what's really important, when we look, say, just at philosophy, philosophy is about truth. Ideas aren't true or false, right? If I were to give you a quiz right now, true or false, lemons. Well, that makes no sense, right? Lemons are neither true nor false. Lemons are yellow, lemons are sour, right? Lemons are fruit, but they're not true or false. The only things that are true or false are propositions, sentences, right? And that's really what philosophy is about. If philosophy is about truth, then philosophy is about propositions. Philosophy is not about ideas. So the question is, if we really want to be philosophers, how do we get from ideas to propositions, right? If ideas are the bricks, what's the mortar that binds them all together so that we can form the walls of this house, right? What sticks our ideas together and creates propositions? That Hume, okay? So associations of ideas associate ideas. That is, they connect ideas into propositions that can be true or false. And he says that if you look at every proposition, every sentence in the language, it's a combination of ideas that come in through the senses and one of three associations. Resemblance, that is like and unlike. Contiguity, that is next to, and that could be either spatially or temporally, that is next to in space, and that's on top of, beside, inside of, underneath, or related to time, before, after, is at the same time as. And then the third one is cause and effect. That is, one thing causes another. And Hume argues that all of our propositions are a combination of ideas that come in through the senses and one of these three associations. So what is the argument he gives? That those three are complete, that there can't be any others? He basically just gives a shrug of the shoulders. He says, yeah, maybe there are more. Show me another one that can't be reduced to these three, and I'll go, okay, now we have four, right? He says, I thought about it, and I thought about it. I only came up with three, so that's what I think. But in no way is he married to these three. It's just that these are the three that he thinks everything breaks down to. And now we get to the most important section in all of Hume. Skeptical doubts concerning the operations of the understanding. This is the section that makes Hume Hume. Okay, so we're going to start with a distinction, and it's a distinction that we've seen before. This was present in Leibniz, where we have a distinction between two, Hume is going to call them relations of ideas and matters of fact. Now notice there's a difference between relations of ideas and associations of ideas. An association of ideas is the mortar that sticks the ideas together in order to give us a proposition. Relations of ideas are a kind of sentence, a flavor of sentence, always true or always false. These are our necessary truths. He puts it this way. Propositions of this kind are discoverable by the mere operation of thought, without dependence on what is anywhere in the universe. Though there never were a circle or a triangle in nature, the truths demonstrated by Euclid would forever retain their certainty and evidence. And so once again, we have somebody reaching back to Euclid, right? And he's reaching back to Euclid here for a very particular reason. That reason is because these are the sorts of relations of ideas that we're going to see justified by the means of the rationalists, right? The rationalists love Euclid. The rationalists, and we saw it in Descartes, we saw it in Spinoza, we saw it in Euclid gives us the template. Euclid gives us the approach by which we should model all human knowledge. And Hume is going to give them a nod. He's going to go, yeah. For Euclid, Euclid's approach was exactly the right kind. And relations of ideas are the sorts of sentences that are open to exactly the sort of justification that you get from these sorts of thinkers. Okay, so Euclid is absolutely right with respect to this one kind of truth, relations of ideas, necessary truths. But those aren't the only kinds of truths we have, right? Just as Leibniz points out, we also have contingent truths, right? And these are what he calls matters of fact. The contrary of every matter of fact is still possible, because it can never imply a contradiction and is conceived by the mind with the same facility and distinctness as if ever so conformable to reality. Notice the word distinctness, right? Again, another little dig at Descartes, right? These ideas that are matters of fact can be understood with distinctness, but that doesn't mean they are necessarily true. So the sentence, "It is now raining," is false. It isn't now raining. Last night, boy, oh boy, was it raining, right? And so the idea is whether it's raining now or not is a matter of fact. We have to look out the window and see what the weather is, because I could conceive of it being rainy. I could conceive of it being not rainy, right? Either one is possible. Neither, is a contradiction. And so matters of fact, could be either way. Ooh, this is actually seeming kind of friendly, right? There are two kinds of truth. So we have an argument going on over epistemology between the rationalists and the empiricists. One side says pure reason is a justification for human knowledge. The other side says no, sense perception is. Hume says, hey, look, guys, there are two kinds of truths. One seems open to the reason. The other seems open to the senses. We can pull everybody together where everybody gets something. And then we come and say, okay, I see your side, you see my side. We can now get along. We can end the protests. We can all just live happily ever after. Right? No. This is Hume. Just when you think it's going to get kind, he pulls the rug out from under you. Okay, so the rationalist, he says, yeah, can claim victory with respect to one part of truth, right? The relations of ideas absolutely are justified in exactly the way the rationalists say, right? Notice what he says about circles and triangles. Yes, you're absolutely right. Euclid gives us eternal and necessary truth about them, even though, he says, they don't actually exist in the world. Yes, you've justified certain propositions as absolutely true, but they're not actually true of anything, right? They lay claim to truths that are about nothing. It's about, it's like being the world's expert in the biology of unicorns. Why would you even bother having a lab, right? The point is, yes, you are absolutely right. You have absolute knowledge about these things that don't exist. So while he does seem to be giving the rationalists something, it's something absolutely trivial. He says all the meaningful truths are going to be matters of fact, right? And these can't be determined through the use of the reason alone, right? The rationalists are wrong about all of the important truths. So it looked like it was going to be a tie, right? It looked like it was going to be a friendly, happy ending where the world of truth was divided into two parts. And now he says, yeah, you guys get this part, rationalists, but there's nothing actually in it. So being an Anglo, being an empiricist, really what he's doing is underhandedly winning the game for the empiricists, right? No. Again. Again, this is Hume. No one is safe. He says, okay, let's look at matters of fact. What's interesting about matters of fact is that there are actually two kinds of those too. Right? There are those that require reasoning and those that don't. Right? Are just openly accessible to perception. Right? These are the ones that don't require reasoning. Do you have feet? You don't need to reason. You just look down and see if they're still attached. Right? Is the sky blue? You don't need reason. You just look up at the sky. Is the cat on the mat? Oh no. Let me go find a cat. Right? So when we deal with matters of fact that involve resemblance and contiguity as their associations, these are directly accessible to the senses. These don't require any sort of reasoning at all. And these, yeah, it's absolutely true that these are open to the senses. Well, go ahead, Sasha.
So this might be a little late within asking this, but as I've noticed as I was reading along that there are some sentences that start with a dot in the beginning and then a dot at the end. Is that his way of doing like quotations? Like I meant to ask this in the beginning.
No, I don't know why he puts those there.
Is it for emphasis or is it just him?
It may be a way of doing italics. I'll have to check because in other other versions of the text, those aren't there. So I don't know, to be honest, what those represent.
If you look at the top of the text, it'll explain what those dots are for. Because there's different, there's the solid black ones and there's the little dots. And the little dots they weren't actually written by Hume. They were written by the author to make it more clear. So there's a lot of stuff that he adds to make things nice in today's world.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Alrighty, thank you.
No worries. So going back to the point is that, right, we have truth divided into two parts. Right? There are necessary truths and relations of ideas, and rationalists justify those, right? But they do so at the cost of there not actually being any content to those propositions. On the other hand, there are matters of fact, and those do have content, but those get divided into two flavors, those that require reasoning and those that don't require reasoning. The ones that don't require reasoning, the empiricists absolutely have legitimate grounds for justification. You use the senses and you see if the cat is on the mat. You use your senses and see if the sky is blue. Okay, so the empiricists get at least half of that. They get the other half too, right? Well, Hume wants to say, yeah, these are certainly less trivial than sentences about circles because circles don't actually exist. At least the sky is. And yeah, it is blue. And yes, the cat is on the mat. But really, that's all you care about? We're philosophers. We want the deep propositions. We want the real propositions. Empiricists get slightly more than the rationalists. But what about the sentences that really matter? What about our most important beliefs? Science. Right? So rationalists justify truths about nothing. Empiricists justify truths about triviality. But we do have some really important knowledge, right? We have certain propositions that we are really, really, really proud of, right? What language is Hume writing in? English, right? Those who wrote in English look to Isaac Newton, right? This is just a generation earlier who came up with this unbelievable theory that seems to explain almost everything in the universe. We have knowledge. We have deep knowledge. We have important knowledge. Surely that's justified, right? I mean, if you read Newton, and those of you who are interested in a term paper topic in philosophy of science, there's lots of good work to be done on Newton. Newton is a philosopher as much as a physicist, and he's an empiricist. He says he gets it all through observation and inductive logic, right? Scientific truths require reasoning, right? So remember, we have these matters of fact divided into two parts. We have those that don't require reason, that you just directly observe, but now we're dealing with the second kind of matter of fact, those that do require some reasoning. And here, Hume says, we get our third relation of ideas, cause and effect, right? The study of science is the study of cause and effect. That is what science is about. And so the question here is, okay, what sort of reasoning is needed to justify cause and effect claims? That kind of reasoning is inductive. Now, let's talk about that briefly before moving on, right? This should be review for you, but for those for whom it's not, right? Two kinds of logic, deductive logic and inductive logic. Deductive logic is the logic that takes us from broad to narrow. It's non-ampliative inference. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? We start with a proposition about all men being mortal, and we end with a more narrow conclusion about one guy being mortal, right? So we're arguing from broad to narrow. In a deductive argument, the content of the conclusion is contained within the content of the premises. Inductive arguments, on the other hand, are ampliative inferences. That is, they're inferences that go beyond the premises. And the example, I think everyone here has seen me do it, right? I go around the class, do you have a cell phone? Do you have a cell phone? Do you have a phone? Do you have a phone? Do you have a phone? Everybody has a phone. And so we say, okay, we read them up on the board, therefore all 28 people have phones, therefore we believe the 29th and I find in the hallway. We have no idea who that person's going to be, but based on this evidence, do we have good reason to infer something beyond the premises? The premises are only about these 28 people. Induction is what takes us to the 29th, right? So induction is ampliative inference, and what Hume is going to argue is that the only way to justify belief in cause and effect propositions is to use inductive logic, because cause and effect, he will show us, goes beyond anything we can observe. So he says, look, cause and effect happens between two events. And they happen between events that happen in a time order, right? Causes come first, effects come second. But to say that A caused B is more than just to say that A came before B, right? What I'll often do to illustrate this is I'll ask somebody in the class to write the word guacamole on the top of their page of notes. And as they start to write, I clap my hands. And the idea here is first I clap my hands, then the person wrote the word guacamole, right? So one happened before the other. But did one happen because of the other? No, right? If it were the case that the clapping of the hands caused the person to write the word guacamole, then I'd be clapping more often because that would just be hilarious, right? The idea here is that cause and effect certainly has a temporal element, right? It has a time-based element, but it goes beyond that. Now, the time-based part of it, the temporal contiguity, the fact that one comes first and the other comes second, that is directly observable, right? I can see that I clapped my hands. I can see that he wrote the word guacamole, right? And I could see that one happened first. So that is a directly observable empirical matter. But can you ever actually observe the causing? Right? This is what Hume calls the causal nexus. That is the secret power. That is the causing. So I used to have a colleague at Gettysburg in the philosophy department named Hanno Bullhoff. Hanno was a great guy. He taught logic before I taught it. His nickname was Hanno the Hammer. He was a tough grader. But the thing about Hanno, he loves baseball. And so every time he would teach Hume, he'd make sure he was doing it in the spring, and he would hold class at the baseball game, play baseball. And he'd say, okay, we're here to test Hume, right? The batter is going to hit the ball, and hitting the ball is going to cause it to fly off. I want you to look as carefully as you can at every batter and see if you can see the causing. Right? The idea is you see the bat swing, you see the bat touch the ball, you see the ball go off. You see the event that is the cause, you see the event that is the effect. Do you ever actually see the causing? Can you observe the causing itself? And Hume says, no, you can't. The causal nexus is not observable. Yet, we're trying to justify belief in cause and effect propositions. So what justifies then our belief in causation? We do believe that things cause each other, right? Don't stick a fork in an electric socket. Why? It will cause you to be unhappy. That's just a fact. We believe that, right? We all believe that, right? Right?
Sure.
You're still there, right? You haven't gone off to get fork? Okay, thank you, Eric. Right, the point, I just needed to be calmed down, right? This is why they don't give philosophers lab sections, right? So the point is, we all believe in cause and effect. We do. Had me taken my suggestion and not put forks in electric sockets. Why? Because I believe in cause and effect. You believe in cause and effect. We all believe in cause and effect, but yet we can't observe the causing. What justifies our belief in cause and effect, which is the heart of all of our scientific reasoning? What justifies our belief in any science, right? Don't smoke. Smoking causes cancer. We believe that. Why? The Surgeon General says so. Why does the Surgeon General say so? Because there's evidence. There's good reason to think it. Well, what constitutes that good reason for belief in cause and effect? And the answer he'll say is induction. However, this gives rise to the most important argument in all of Hume. So, what I've done here is I've created a little dialogue that illustrates Hume's argument. I need 2 volunteers to read. I need an A and a B.
I got you.
All right, you want A?
Yes.
Sasha is A. Who's going to be B?
I volunteer.
Okay, Julia, you are B. Okay, so we're under a tree. We're on a campus.
Perfect.
It's in a quad, and we have philosophers around, and you're 2 fairly confident philosophers in a lower level introductory philosophy class. Okay, that's the setting. You guys got it? Action.
Yes. Do you believe the sun will rise tomorrow?
Why, yes, I do.
Why do you believe this?
On the basis of observation.
It can't be. Tomorrow hasn't happened yet. You can't see it.
Oh, then it must be on the basis of deduction.
Can't be. It is a matter of fact, not a relationship of idea. That was relation of ideas. Wow. It is possible for it to be otherwise. So it cannot be the result of deduction.
Oh, right. Well, to be honest, the real reason I think the sun will rise tomorrow is that it has every other day.
So you believe it. You believe it because there is an inductive argument supporting it.
Yes, that's it.
So, why do you believe the conclusion of the inductive argument is probably true?
Observation?
Can't be. Because it is inductive, its conclusion is beyond the scope of experience.
Deduction?
Can't be. Because it is inductive, its conclusion is beyond the scope of the premises.
Well, to be honest, I believe it because most of the time when I make inductive arguments, the conclusion turns out to be true.
So you believe it because there is an inductive argument supporting it.
Yes, that's it.
So, why do you believe the conclusion of the inductive argument is probably true?
Observation?
Can't be. It is inductive. Its conclusion is beyond the scope of experience.
Deduction?
Can't be. Because it is inductive. Its conclusion is beyond the scope of the premises.
Well, to be honest, I believe it because most of the time when I make inductive arguments, the conclusion turns out to be true.
So you believe it because there is an inductive argument supporting it.
Yes, that's it.
So, why do you believe the conclusion of the inductive argument is probably true?
Observation?
Can be, because it is inductive. Its conclusion is beyond the scope of experience.
Deduction?
Can't be. Because it is inductive, its conclusion is beyond the scope of the premises.
Well, to be honest, I believe it because most of the time, when I make inductive arguments, the conclusion turns out to be true.
So you believe because there's an inductive argument supporting it.
Yes, that's it.
So, why do you believe the conclusion of an inductive argument is probably true?
Observation?
Can't be, because it is inductive. Its conclusion is beyond the scope of experience.
Deduction?
Can't be, because it is inductive. Its conclusion is beyond the scope of the premises.
Well, to be honest, I believe it because most of the time when I make inductive arguments, the conclusion turns out to be true.
And scene.
I was like, if there's a part 6.
Oh my gosh.
So now you see Hume's problem of induction.
We learned about this in analytical philosophy, and I remember reading through the thing, and I was like, "Oh, we're doing this." Absurdist play.
Exactly. And that absurdity is what Hume wants to point out, which is our most important knowledge. Virtually everything we believe as a result excuse me, of cause and effect, which is based on inductive reasoning. So what justifies our belief in induction? Can't be observation, can't be deduction. There's only one thing left, which is induction. But if you try to use induction to justify induction, you create a circular argument. And on we go with no foundation underneath of it. And so notice what Hume just took down. Newton, all of science, that if you eat bread, it will nourish and not poison you, that the sun will rise tomorrow, pretty much almost every single thing you believe in for belief. If you jump off a 5th-story balcony, you have no reason to believe you'll fall. This is why he said, be a philosopher, but above all, be a man. Don't be a moron. Just realize that this is actually kind of complicated. So, we have Hume's very famous problem of induction. There's no justification for the rational belief in inductive arguments. Science is based on inductive arguments. Therefore, there is no reason to believe in science. But, of course, there's reason to believe in science. Don't stick forks in electric sockets. Why? What is that justification? Why do we believe in inductive arguments? And we do, right? That's section 5. He gives a skeptical solution to these skeptical doubts. He starts by saying, everything and everyone hates a skeptic, except for the truth. All right? The idea is the skeptic is obnoxious. We all know people like that, right? And they are just awful to hang out with. Skeptics are simply obnoxious. The problem is, Hume wants to say, maybe they're right. Maybe that's why they seem so obnoxious, because the truths they're trying to convince us of aren't truths we want to hear. That is, we think we know things that we don't actually know, and they're a threat to our own arrogance. He says this: suppose a person, though endowed with the strongest faculties of reason and reflection, to be brought on a sudden into this world. So all of a sudden, poof, you have a genius that just shows up. He would indeed immediately observe a continual succession of objects and one event following another, but he would not be able to discover anything further. He would not at first, by any reasoning, be able to reach the idea of cause and effect, since the particular powers by which all natural observations are performed never appear to the senses. Nor is it reasonable to conclude merely because one event in one instance precedes another, that therefore it's the cause, and the other the effect. Their conjunction may be arbitrary and casual. Notice casual is different from causal. There may be no reason to infer the existence of one from the appearance of the other. And, in a word, such a person without more experience could never employ his conjecture or reasoning concerning any matter of fact to be assured of anything beyond what was immediately present to his memory and senses. So you've got the genius who just pops into the world, starts observing the world, sees lots of things, but at first there's no sense of cause and effect. Just the sky is blue, this person is putting a fork in an electric socket, this person is unhappy, right? They just see things, but there is no cause and effect at first. But then, suppose again that he's acquired more experience and has lived so long in the world as to have observed similar objects or events to be constantly conjoined together. What is the consequence of this experience? He immediately infers the existence of one object from the appearance of the other. Yet he has not, by all his experience, acquired any idea or knowledge of the secret power by which the one object produces the other. Nor is it by any process of reasoning he's engaged to draw this inference. But still, he finds himself determined to draw it. And though he should be convinced that his understanding has no part in the operation, he would nevertheless continue in the same course of thinking. There is some other principle which determines him to form such a conclusion. Notice how radical this is. Notice what Hume is saying right here. What Hume is saying is that if a human being, a smart human being, looks at the world, sees one thing, then sees another, sees one thing, then sees another, sees one thing, then sees another. When that person sees the one thing again, what will immediately happen? The person will infer that he's about to see the other. There is this inference that is made. And this is cause and effect, right? We see the one, then we see the other, we think this is going to cause that. And yet we never see the causal nexus. It's not through any idea or knowledge that he has through reason or observation that he can get in touch with this secret power that is the causing. And yet our mind can't not think it. Our mind has to think it by some other principle. What is that other principle? Well, he's got an answer, but he's the first to say it's really not a good one. This principle is custom or habit. For wherever the repetition of any particular act or operation produces a propensity to renew the same act or operation without being impelled by any reasoning or process of the understanding, we always say that this propensity is the effect of custom. By employing that word, we pretend, by employing that word, we pretend not to have given the ultimate reason of such a propensity. We haven't explained it, we've just named it. We only point out a principle of human nature, which is universally acknowledged and which is well known by its effects. Perhaps we can push our inquiries no farther, or pretend to give the cause of this cause, but must rest contented with the ultimate principle which we can assign of all our conclusions from experience. So, why do we believe in cause and effect? Because that's the way we're wired. That's what a human mind does. A human mind acquires habits. Whenever you see me drop the pen, you see the pen fall. You see me drop the pen, you see the pen fall. You see me drop the pen, you see the pen fall. So when you see me drop the pen again, you just assume that there's something pulling that pen down. Gravity. Why? Do you see gravity? No, you don't see gravity. You don't see the cause. You never see the cause. Well, I had a science class that gave me an equation. Yeah, it gave you an equation. What did that equation do? You plug in one thing you observe, you plug in something else that you observe, and look, those two numbers turn out to be equal when you go through this mathematical calculation. Yay! All that means is that you have a correlation that fits the observations. What is gravity? It's the cause. Have you ever seen it? No. So the idea here is, why do we believe it? Out of a mere force of habit. There's no reason. There is no good reason to believe in the results of science. We just can't help but do it. That's just the way our mind is wired. We are creatures of habit, and those habits form our beliefs. Not rationally, not with good reason, they just do. And so notice what Hume has just done. Hume has just blown up all of science. Now, who might be happy with that at this time? Remember, you're coming on the heels of the scientific revolution, and the scientific revolution removed Hume from absolute power, the church. So is the church going to be happy with Hume for doing their dirty work? No. Why? That's what we will do on Monday. Okay, so finish reading the second section of Hume, and we will pick it up then and there.